était né à Bethléem. La lumière pleuvait avec l'eau du baptême. Au ciel, une étoile, la nuit nous guidait. Mais il y a 2000 ans que cet enfant est mort. Les fusées dans le ciel bousculent les étoiles. Et sur la terre, le bien chemine avec le mal. Mon Dieu, irons-nous jusqu'au port?
Dis-nous quel est le chemin. Dis-nous quel est le chemin. Dis-nous quel est le chemin qui va vers la lumière. Dis-nous quel est le chemin. Dis-nous quel est le chemin. Dis-nous quel est le chemin qui va vers la lumière.
All right, all right. It sounds like we're live, so I'm gonna go ahead and do our little intro. All right, we are live. Hi everyone, so excited to have you here. Welcome back to Nibbin Ink Fest, our last day of full events for Nibbin Ink Fest 2026. My name is Joan Zahra-Dark. I am still your host for this last batch of events, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to our required labor organizing event as part of our work with as Cartoonists United, a comics labor organization, with our event, labor organizing. What's that? I'm really stoked to have this one going. I think we are gonna have a great talk here with Nicky, who I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on to. But real quick, just if you didn't already know about Nibbin Ink Fest, make sure you check out nif.cartoonist.coop. Check out all the amazing stuff we still have today and tomorrow for you to pick up everything from the marketplace. Check out the sampler, check out Oops All Comics, all that amazing stuff over at nif.cartoonist.coop, not .com. And take a look at our little online fest while we're still going. We've got captions going for folks that are joining us via Zoom who would like to have those enabled, and a transcript will also be available of this for folks who would like that as well. But without further ado, Nicky Rodriguez is a comic artist, anarchist, and baby labor organizer. She helped start the CCA Student Union at California College of the Arts just before the pandemic began, and prior to that was involved in supporting the adjunct and then newly formed staff unions on campus. You can find and purchase her work at artofnickyrodriguez.com. That link will also be in the chat, as well as reading her webcomic, The Unlucky Ones and the Edge of Nowhere. Nicky, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for letting me do this. So yeah, the intro said, I have a little bit of history with labor organizing, mostly through just kind of being in environments at California College of the Arts that were just blossoming with different labor movements amongst the staff and the faculty of different levels there. And they're even though the school is sadly closing down now, the staff and the adjunct unions are still fighting really hard to kind of keep part of CCA alive. So that's great. They're still going strong. And And then a lot of my kind of more recent experience with labor organizing comes from just doing workshops and like through perusing the learning materials of like EWOC, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. They also got started like during the pandemic, which was really cool. And they're just like this grassroots organization that helps, support people who are trying to like organize their workplace across different industries. There we go. So like just really quickly, like I am doing this presentation from like the standpoint of like the United States. That's like obviously where I'm located. That's like what I'm familiar with, but kind of in a broader sense, some of the organizing tips and techniques are applicable kind of like across any country. Just like always remember, if you're looking to do any kind of like labor organizing, make sure you look into the specific labor laws of like your country, or in the case of the United States, your state, because states, cities, like there are different labor laws at different government levels, like unfortunately, in most of the states. But a union basically is just a group of two or more employees who share common interests and that are working together to advance goals, such as like, like increasing your wages, trying to get benefits like health insurance, changing your schedules so that people have more fair hours, things like that. And unions are membership driven, and they're like democratic organizations that are required by law to have financial transparency and fair elections and, like fair representation of all your workers. When you think of unions, like from the standpoint of the United States, you also need to kind of like understand like these two other important aspects of like labor law and how labor law functions in this country. And the NLRB is something you hear a lot when you hear about like unions and kind of like trying to unionize. And that is the National Labor Relations Board. They're like this independent federal agency created in the 30s to like protect employees' rights to organize, engage with one another, and just decide whether or not they all collectively want to like be in a union or not, and have that union represent with or bargain with their employer for, different gains. And they also exist to resolve unfair labor practices. So basically, whenever your employer breaks the law, which like lots of employers do all the time, that's like their favorite thing to do. And then they also are the ones conducting the secret ballot elections where you're like voting for your union. And then the NLRA. The NLRA is the National Labor Relations Act. That's another important part of like something you should be aware of whenever you're thinking about labor organizing. And it's an act that protects the rights of most private sector employees to organize. And it protects the rights of workers to act collectively to address workplace conditions with or without a union. But it's important to know that like this only applies to like most private sector employees. And like in the next few slides, like I'll go ahead and kind of like break that down about like who these types of workers are, like what industries, and kind of like where the exceptions fall. But basically, if you're covered by the NLRA, it's illegal for your employer to like engage in retaliation. So they can't like fire you for talking about wanting to unionize. They can't give you any kind of like punishment. They can't penalize you for any of those like activities. But like, historically, that is something that still like continues to happen. And, that's why you have the NLRB there and like the unfair labor practices, which we'll also like get into a little bit. And this is, like who is allowed to organize and form a union. Most workers like across the board. So, you have like teacher unions, nurse unions, you have unions of like graduate student workers, which like might seem kind of like atypical, just depending on like how the school categorizes student workers, and like where those funds for their wages come from. Then you have like service and retail workers, like the Starbucks union and things like that. And typically anyone who's like in a non-managerial position, so you're not hiring or firing anybody, and you're in the private sector, the federal government or like the state, county, like level local governments, for the most part, you're going to be able to like have the right to unionize. But again, it's just like double check in your state, because especially recently, like, like labor laws have like been changing, and like every state has like different caveats that you need to like pay attention to. And so anyone who doesn't necessarily fall under these protected rights are domestic workers, independent contractors, and agricultural workers. They're not covered by, federal labor laws, but some states do give them, certain organizing rights. And there have still been gains made from these like different groups of like non-traditional workers, where they have organized and unionized, albeit in a slightly different way, to be able to, fight for their rights and like get the gains that they deserve as workers. And yeah, public employees in some states also, do not have the right to collective bargaining. It's like very much like a mixed bag. So it's like always important when you're deciding to like want to organize and like talk to your coworkers that you make sure you're kind of like looking into the details of like the laws of whatever your region is, just to make sure, everyone's on the same page and like you're building the best strategy for success, essentially. And so like I mentioned about, the workers who don't fall under the NLRA, like independent contractors, some workers actually file for a misclassification with the NLRB, which is something you could do. So it's like if you're an independent contractor and you're like, actually, I feel like I'm like working in the capacity of an employee. So like I think you need to like reclassify me and give me employee rights. You could go to the NLRB for that, or like other local uh, labor entities in your area, and they'll basically decide, like, are you actually misclassified? And then, that helps you more easily work towards the like traditional pathway of unionizing and like win the right to organize and like collectively bargain. But this basically means that independent contractors can unionize. They can unionize just like all other workers can. It's just, they don't have the same protections as other workers. So, oftentimes that means you don't see a lot of independent contractors organizing, or just like it looks different the way they go about it, just kind of like in terms of like their little process. But it's still not impossible for, a bunch of independent contractors to go ahead and like get together and fight for their rights. These are like the points that the NLRB uses to decide if you're an employee or an independent contractor. You don't need to like memorize that, especially because like I think recently too, one of the rules had like changed, or like something about like the weight of certain rules. But essentially, the misclassification occurs when your employer decides to call you an independent contractor because they want to avoid paying the taxes and the benefits of, that an employee would have. So it's just essentially like, they want to hold on to their money. But under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, that basically it gives you like the right to minimum wage, overtime. It also like sets up kind of like the youth labor standards for people who are like underage, and things like that. And obviously, if you're an independent contractor, you don't fall under those protections. But by looking at these different points and like considering that whenever you're like doing your organizing, it also just kind of like helps strengthen your strategy of just like, okay, these are all the things that we feel apply to us. You just need to remember that this test isn't like, oh, if you have like 90% of you meet 90% of this criteria, then like, oh, you're definitely an employee. It's more like looked at holistically. So it's just like any one of these categories might have more weight than the other. It's like entirely based on each individual case. But a lot of precedent has been set for like independent contractors and kind of like how we understand this like list of criteria. And so like these are some of the groups that are like just barely covered or like not even covered by the NLRA, which basically just means that, you know, they're not considered traditional workers. They're like independent contractors or like agricultural workers or something like that. But they were still able to win gains, and also like some of them were able to like win the right to organize and collectively bargain. So like one example, recently in like 2024, the Dartmouth basketball team, they won their ruling from the NLRB, basically saying like, yeah, you can unionize. And they set up their union drive, but just because of like, you know, like the presidential election and just like the shift in power, they decided to like withdraw it and just kind of like hold on to that. And I'm assuming just like still operate and organize. And then hopefully in the future, you know, like go forth with that official vote. In 2015, you had something similar happen where like the Northwestern athletes won their ruling and ordered their election to unionize. A really important case for like independent contractor precedent when it comes to organizing is the Atlanta Opera Stylists. This was from 2023, and like the quick and dirty of it is basically like it overturned a decision made in 2019, basically saying like, you know, like drivers for Super Shuttle and whatnot, like they are operating as independent contractors. So like, you know, they don't have the right to unionize. But the Atlanta Opera case basically showed that in going back to rules from like 2014, it helped show that like these individual makeup artists and like hairstylists and things like that who are working for the Atlanta Opera, because of how the Atlanta Opera is like controlling their ability to work elsewhere because of like how much work they're doing. It's like kind of giving them a little bit of exclusivity. That was an important factor in determining that like, hey, you actually are employees. So it's just like you do have the right to unionize. And that was like really important because it's just like, it kind of goes to show that each individual case is, even if you think like, oh, this is like a similar class of workers, a similar industry, it's always going to be different. And it's always worth looking into kind of like what precedent has been set before to kind of get an idea of like, you know, like what changes have happened, why did those changes happen, and like what can be won for all these different kinds of like independent contractors. And I'll also help you consider like, you know, if you're a hairstylist or like, you know, a tattoo artist or something like that where you're like renting space, it's just like there might still be possibility for you to like organize, just like depending on like your workplace environment. So it's like not necessarily a lost cause just because you know you're a freelancer. And for graduate student workers, it's very job title dependent, which basically means that like, so in 2024 at Brown University, it was ruled that like the MFA students at the school who are graduate student workers were employees and could unionize, but the students who were externally funded, like through the MIT case in 2023, didn't qualify for the same rights as like internally funded graduate student workers. So it's like, again, it's very, every case is like unique, but that doesn't mean it's not worth moving forward with, because you never know, you know, whether or not you're going to flip precedent and like set a new example, and also just kind of like continue to prove that like independent contractors are still able to organize and like collectively build solidarity and just kind of like worker power to go ahead and like shape their workplace into the environment that they want. And the different, oh my god, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, the different like groups of workers under the no legal pathway to recognition part. These are basically different worker groups that were ruled like, you know, you don't have the right to unionize, or that decided like, we pretty much assume, you know, we don't have that right, so we're not going to go through with like the whole NLRB filing. But that didn't keep them from organizing. They basically like still got together. So like the Tennessee Drivers Union, they are not officially recognized by the NLRB, but are still a union because they're a collective group of workers working for like, you know, causes that are important to them collectively. And they have won city level wins, like designated rideshare zones for like increased safety for pickup and drop off at the places like the airport. They've also won like, I think they're in the process of like trying to set up a curfew for the motorized scooters. So that way there's like less incidents involving the motorized scooters and like Lyft drivers. You have the Amazon Flex drivers, which is also like a recent thing. And they all came together kind of like across the country to go ahead and file for mass arbitration against Amazon. So kind of like this like giant, yeah, the scooters are obnoxious. Uh, oh my God, where was I going with that? I like got sidetracked by the scooters comment, sorry. But basically it's just like, you know, they all came together across the country. So even though they weren't in in a like in the same workplace, in the same like, you know, Amazon warehouse or driving facility in the same state, they all still were able to like organize remotely, virtually, and decide, you know, we're gonna do mass arbitration, we're gonna sue Amazon, so that way they can like give us all the benefits that they've denied us for like X amount of time. And like notoriously, if you've seen the news, like Amazon is like super like big on union busting, and Amazon Flex has kind of been used as like this union busting tool, and that they were originally created as like a way to kind of like scab the Amazon delivery drivers that were like, I think like at the internal level, but at the same time, it's just like they, if Amazon Flex is like going to continue as it is, it's just like they are still operating as employees, just as their like predecessors were, or I guess like their compatriots, because they're still like there, even though they're outsourcing. And that's why they went ahead and like went through with like mass arbitration. So it's like when you organize, you can also organize and kind of like take these legal pathways to like sue for your rights, which is something that like the New York City taxi drivers have done. They're like a fully independent body of like independent contractors because they're like employed directly by the city of New York. But they still came together, organized, function as their own union, and were able to win things like medallion debt forgiveness, which is like, you know, a whole lot of money they get back because, you know, owning your car to be a taxi driver in the city is not cheap. And, you know, like, how do you get started organizing? I think like the most important thing to remember as you're getting started having these conversations is just that it's always a battle of like hope against fear, you know, like the hope for a better future, the hope for a better environment for you and your coworkers. That is like what is healing you and driving you guys to like come together, build your power, and like fight against the powers that be. And a lot of times people are kind of like afraid to take that step because, you know, they think they're going to face retaliation. But the reality is that you're subject to that retaliation kind of like whether you're in a union or not, because it's just like a lot of bosses can still kind of like fire you as they please. So it's just like you're kind of in this situation of like, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't, where it's just like you're not going to get any positive change out of sticking with the status quo and like being complacent. And you're not going to see any positive change if you're not trying to fight back against it and understanding that like this isn't an individual battle. It's not a matter of like, oh, one person going up to the boss and asking for something. It's all about coming together and leveraging that worker power, because at the end of the day, the workers are the ones that keep things going. That's why like when you see strikes happen, sometimes strikes go on for a really long time. And it's just like, you know that these companies are just like hemorrhaging money, and that is a tactic to kind of like force their hand and be like, hey, you know, like we can't do anything without the workers. We need to like find a way to like concede and come to an agreement. And like that's really important to remember. It's just like it's never an individual battle. It's everyone coming together with like the same hope for all these different better circumstances for like not just the individual, but for like everybody. So that way, you know, you just have like a much healthier workplace environment, and that you have like a much easier ability to, you know, just like do more than just stay afloat, you know, like do more than like just survive with the wages you're earning. So the organizing kind of like methodology I'm most familiar with is the organizing committee model. This is it was kind of like used, I think, a little bit when I was like at California College of the Arts. I wasn't like there during the formation of like the adjunct union, so it's like I didn't see like all the like bits and pieces that came together. I was like really just a part of the conversations like as they were getting ready for bargaining, and just I was just like listening in and kind of getting an idea of like, you know, how does a union function, and how do the unions function in this particular environment, and also what are the different issues that are common between the two groups, and how can we like bridge the gap and actually like work together and not think of this as like staff versus adjuncts versus students, which was kind of like very much the environment at the start of all the organizing, unfortunately. But like then, you know, all three organize, and like then you see them kind of like doing little like walkouts and strikes together, which was like really great to see as the years went on. But the organizing committee model was like made popular and is like used and taught by the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, EWOC, that I mentioned at the start of this. And it's basically a method of rank and file organizing that entails fostering a community of like respected worker leaders, where, you know, the power comes from the workers. The workers are the ones like doing the thing in the union, and they're like doing it together. Engaging a supermajority of all the coworkers in your workplace. So getting as much of you on board as possible, and kind of like giving you all the education you need to educate each other, and also feel empowered to like do this work, and just like be in conversation about it all with everybody. And, you know, you're organizing around a shared demand or set of demands, and it's fundamentally about like working together to build that campaign, and not just kind of like imagining, oh, we are a workplace of like 20 people, we want to join a union, but like this or form a union, and we're just gonna like let this one person kind of like be the leader, and kind of like just make the decisions and like have it be very top down and stuff. And like that is not what the organizing committee model is. Like it's very much about like representation, leadership development. It's like a democratic and like very big on transparency within like decision making. Um, and rank and file organizing is just like the method of organizing that engages as much workers like as possible to like shape the future of the union. So it's just kind of like very worker focused. Like the workers are the voices leading everything, not like outside people who are hired or anything like that. And like the key, the backbone to the organizing committee model is your organizing committee, which like I'll just refer to as the OC kind of like moving forward. And they are basically the kind of like quote unquote leaders within, because they're still, you know, workers in the rank and file, in the union, who are helping to kind of like engage everyone and bring them together and like just get people on board with the organizing. And you want your organizing committee, the people that comprise it, to like, you know, be trustworthy. They should be a good listener. They should know what they're doing, like know about organizing, or at the very least, like be very dedicated and like willing to learn about it. Like, because you could be like very passionate about wanting to do it and just like be forthright about like, you know, I don't know exactly how to do this, but I'm willing to like learn what I need to know so that way I could, you know, be the best that I could be for like the organizing committee and make sure like I'm doing a good job engaging everyone in the workplace. And you know, you want to make sure they have like leadership skills, like can they lead their coworkers into action? And kind of like the best way I've always like described unionizing is like it's never about like each individual being forced to kind of like do an action on their own. It's kind of like if you think about like the Voltron lines or like the Gunman and Gurren Lagann, where it's like they're individual pieces that come together to like, you know, form an even bigger mech or whatever. So it's like that's like always a good metaphor that I've seen used in like the student union that I was like originally a part of, where it's just like, you know, it's all about coming together and like leveraging our power together and like using our own unique skills and like sharing that amongst each other to kind of like build up solidarity and create a sense of unity among the workplace, so it's not super disjointed and just kind of like leaving workers feeling like, oh, they're the only ones with this problem, they're the only ones having this experience, when it might actually be like something that's like across the board, an experience for everybody. Oh, and like an important part about like the organizing committee is like it's not going to be effective if the people in your organizing committee aren't willing to do the work. Like you need to like really commit to the bit. And when I started or like was part of the CCA student union, we very much kind of like, especially since this was like before the pandemic began, like just before it was kind of like very chaotic, as we were like organizing, kind of like figuring out how to organize, but like we lacked the knowledge of like this kind of like organizing model. And I feel like if we had that, we would have had a little bit more growth. And like thankfully there has been like some longevity where it's like there are still students kind of like manning some of like the social media accounts to at least be a voice piece for the students, or a mouthpiece for the students, which is like really great. But it's like if we had the knowledge of, you know, like building an organizing committee proper, and then also understanding how to kind of like engage the rank and file, then I think there would have been more actual actions being done as opposed to like just activism, which is like still very important, but it's like just drawing the attention to like different issues. While it might inspire people to want to engage in an action, it's just like they're going to need the tools and like the understanding of like, okay, like what action are we going to do, and like how do we do that and stuff like that. And like activism will only go so far with like getting you there. But it was still like a really great learning experience. And like I mentioned, you know, like it still exists in some capacity, which is really nice. And there's still very much like kind of um, supportive between like the adjunct union and the staff union. So that like makes me really happy. So the OC is all about, you know, looking at your coworkers, assessing them, and finding who would be like the best fit. And like before you could do that, the most important part of like starting your organizing is a workplace chart. And that's basically, just mapping out your entire work ecosystem to see like who are the different worker groups, who are the different workers in your group and those groups, like what social groups exist, like organic leaders, just kind of like really just like that social environment there. And this like came up actually with like the adjunct union, where it was like people were unsure about like putting their contact information or like giving out their contact information or anything like that. And like your bosses already have like a list of like all their workers and stuff like that. And like as someone who worked as a help desk manager, it's like there's a bunch of like externally facing public lists of like contact information and things that like identify, where you are on the worker hierarchy, and things like that also exist like internally. So it's not weird to compile a list of like who you're working with, because it's just like it helps you know who you're working with. Because a lot of times, especially when you work like remotely, you can be like really siloed off and just like not have any clue like who the hell am I working on with this project, like who is it that I'm like emailing, like you just have no idea. And like doing something like mapping out this worker ecosystem like really helps fill in the gaps, and also just like helps you be able to like directly engage with your coworkers a lot more effectively. And like once you make that that kind of like workplace map, then through that you start to like have your conversations, and like kind of naturally I feel like the OC starts to kind of like become clearer and clearer, and you start to have like conversations with each other in terms of like, oh, I want to take a more active role and like be a part of the OC and kind of like do more of the like explicit organizing work, and like work off of that workplace chart to find all these different people to speak to. And what's important to know about the OC is like it's a commitment, not a title. It's not like a rank that you have where you're like higher than everybody. Because like again, it's just like we're all workers across the board. It's just like it's a commitment. You have to be willing to put in the work. And like what's important to understand about like a union is like there isn't a work requirement. Like you're not required to do XYZ tasks in order to like enter the union and like stay in the union. But if you are going to be one of like the organizing like leaders, you need to understand that like, you're gonna have to like put in time and effort outside of what you're already doing to want to like have these meetings about strategy and like have these one-on-one conversations with other coworkers and things like that, and just kind of like do the research you need for the strategies too. And that's like, I can understand that like for some people that might seem like really daunting, but it's like at the same time, a good OC is going to help you. They're going to like catch you up to speed basically. And they're going to like help support you in learning what you need to know and kind of like getting started taking on more of these like leadership qualities, because like so long as you're all working towards the same dream and you've all got that passion and hope for like change, it's just like, that's going to fuel you, and you're all going to be like supporting each other. Because like, again, it's all about worker solidarity. So it's just like you're going to want to foster that kind of like leadership and dedication amongst each other, especially within the OC. And an important part to know about the OC, so it's like, you're having like these individual conversations with different workers, letting them know like, what are your concerns about like the workplace? What do you want to change about that? How do you think you could go about changing that? And, like, what does a better future for you look like? And, kind of like how they feel, gauging how they feel about labor organizing and like their possibility of like, do you want to be involved with anything like that, and, find ways to support it. And ideally each OC member will be like, it'll be like a 1-to-10 ratio. So for every one OC member, you'll be speaking to like 10 individual people, and kind of like being their like go-to if they have questions and stuff like that, just like you're keeping them in a loop. So that way it's like, it never feels like oh, I've decided to join this union, but now it still feels very siloed off. I don't know like who to talk to, who's in the union, and so on and so forth. It's just like you're really putting kind of like faces to the name. And this kind of like goes without saying, but your OC should be representative of the workforce you're organizing. So it's like if you're all organizing at, say, like some, or I guess like an institution of higher education like California College of the Arts, it's just like you want to make sure that if you're organizing the adjuncts, that like your OC are also adjuncts and not like assistant professors or like tenured professors or anything like that, because like they're an entire different class of workers. They have an entirely different, like they have benefits like adjuncts don't. So it's just like you want to make sure, you know, like the people who are helping organize you and like educate you are the people who are part of the workforce you're in and who are also able to understand like the different issues that you're all facing. And yeah, just like pay attention to each other, which like again kind of goes without saying, but it's just like if you are so disconnected from, you know, your workplace community, just depending on like the nature of how you guys are divided or whatever, especially whether it's like physically, just like in a building versus like we're organizing kind of like the Amazon Flex drivers like across the country, or like different drivers unions organizing state by state, but like still being kind of in communication with each other. It's like you want to pay attention to what their issues are and like what their concerns are and just like why they think things should change and how they think they should change and kind of like what they're willing to do about it. And always make sure, you know, like, are they willing to take action and be engaged? Because like, again, that's like a really important part of like being in the OC. It's like the backbone of the whole kind of like organizing structure. And the OC doesn't have to be like super big. Like it shouldn't. Like I'm trying to remember the amount, but like I guess it's like maybe at most 10 is like typical in terms of like how many people are on your OC. And so like the organizing conversation. So like you want to talk about labor organizing. How do you do that? Especially because you know, people kind of like are already dealing with some kind of like fear about whether or not they could like talk about this or like how to go about it. But like first and foremost, you should like know, like try to get to know your workers or your coworkers before you kind of like hit them with an organizing pitch. It's like you don't want to just kind of like bombard them, like the people on the sidewalk with the clipboards trying to get you to sign things without like um knowing what it is it's all about and kind of like the important aspects of like, you know, does this resonate with me? How do I think it's going to like create an impact and so on and so forth. So it's just like, you know, try to socialize with everyone before you actually start organizing. And you want it to be kind of like this 80-20 rule of where it's like 80% listening to your coworker and their concerns and kind of like just what their experience is at this workplace. And then, you know, like 20% of you doing the speaking and like asking questions to kind of like continue the conversation, but also just like help build an understanding of like, where do you sit in terms of like wanting to be engaged in labor organizing, and also just like what vision do you have for the future that you're like willing to work towards, or you know, like if you have any understanding of like what you could do to change your situation, if you could do that at all, because it's just like, you know, not everyone's going to have like even a basic understanding of kind of like, you know, labor organizing or anything like that, like within any given workplace. And like, again, that's fine. And especially because like, you know, a lot of workplaces like go out of the way to make sure you don't have that education. But when you're having these conversations, you want to, you know, just like affirm your coworkers like concerns. You want to listen to them and just like say like, answer their questions they have about it, and discuss, like, why is this specific thing unfair? You're actually not alone in thinking that. You're not alone in like experiencing that. You want to make them understand that like the problems they're discussing are collective problems. It's not just like you as an individual like being targeted necessarily. It's just like, oh, this is an across the board issue in terms of like how we workers are being treated. And just getting them on board with the idea like, oh, this is all a collective effort that we have to like come together for in order to kind of like tackle these collective problems that we're all facing. And then you want to make sure you are being frank about like what is the possible response you'll face from like your bosses for like discussing any kind of labor organizing, going forward with like organizing and like unionizing and things like that, because like that's a reality in every workplace. That's just like a reality of organizing, period. But it's also like you need to have the understanding like if you don't do anything, nothing changes. And if you just like expect someone to appear and do it for you, that's just not going to happen. It's like everyone has to come together and work together and kind of like come up with the plan together to make the changes that they want for themselves, because you also can't ever expect the bosses to do that for you. And yeah, just like asking them to take action, like what is your capacity for like being active in the organizing, like not even necessarily like, oh, do you want to join the OC, but just like, do you want to be one of the people kind of like having these direct one-on-one conversations with other coworkers, as opposed to like, maybe just being kind of like a passive supporter where you're like in the union, but it's just like, you're too busy to kind of like have any of these engagements, which like, again, there's no expectation that like everyone in the union is going to like be doing the work. That's like, that would be the dream. But it's also like, everyone has their own life going on, their own schedule. So it's just like you do what you can when you can, and that's totally fine. Because like at the end of the day, it's about fostering care and solidarity with each other and just making sure like we know the people who are like in the same battle with us. And once you've done that, you're ready to start your campaign. It's like, your workplace structure, you formed your OC, you've identified the key issues. So now you can go ahead and like figure out like, okay, like what's our campaign? What are our actions going to be? And the most important part is like remembering that you are building power and unity, and that's what's going to keep your campaign and like your union sustainable, because it'll be built on strong relationships across the members of the union, across the rank and file, and just like knowing that you are all in this together helps inspire, like that bravery to like want to stand up against your boss, regardless of any, possibility of retaliation. And the actions that you do are also, they also act as evidence of like how strong support is for the union internally, and also how strong the support for the union externally is. So like how many people outside of your worker group, outside of your union, are like in support of the cause you're fighting for. And you want to make sure you're like aware of that as you're planning your actions. And yeah, just make sure your goals and expectations are clear. Like what exactly are you fighting for? How are you fighting for it? Like what is it going to change? Like you want to make sure you kind of like answer those key questions, so it's like not super vague and then everyone just kind of like doesn't know, okay, like what am I doing to like help with this? Like you want to make sure everyone's like on the same page so they could be like completely engaged. And that's where you get into like your demands. Again, an issue that's deeply important to a majority of the workforce. So say it's like something like you want to increase your wages because everyone is of the same understanding, like, hey, we're not earning enough hourly. I think we should all have like a 1 hour raise. And it has to be realistic and something that can be won. It's like you need to just be realistic about like what your goals are going to be and how it's going to be won, which like again kind of like comes down to your strategy and the size of like your union, and just like the really fostering that solidarity amongst each other. And the demand should also be concrete and easily defined and explained, because like again, if no one knows what exactly this one demand is for this one specific action, no one's going to know what to do or like how to communicate this cause to like other people, to like get them on board with support. And goes without saying, you know, make it specific. You can't just say like, oh, we want a higher wage, because like, okay, you know, what do you want that new wage to be? Do you want an immediate $1 raise? Do you want incremental raises over time? Like, do you want both of those things? Like, you need to make it specific so that way everyone knows like what they're working for, and that they're all agreeing that like, hey, this is what we want, because we agree that like this is going to help all of us, and it's all going to help all of us significantly. Because yeah, it's supposed to like, you're supposed to be thinking about things that will change the lives of the workforce, like yourself included, but it's about everybody. And the bigger an issue, the more support you're going to need, and the more pressure you have to put on your boss to like win that demand. So it's like you want to also be thinking at scale. And that doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, you know, you have to like start small, like super small. It's just like, you know, be aware of like what it is that are your key issues, and like of those key issues, what demand you know would probably be the easiest to win first. Because then if you win that demand, now you kind of have like, you've bolstered the confidence among the union and shown them like, oh, hey, you know, like we can keep fighting for all these other demands, because this is actually all like realistic and attainable, because we already achieved one of those goals. And you just need to be aware, you know, like the larger that demand is, the more support you need, like the more support you need from like the outside to support you, and the more pressure you'll have to build to like put on your boss in terms of like, you know, like what are you going to do to disrupt the workplace. And so your targets, you pick the people in your workplace that are the ones like making the big decisions, and these are the people you target with your demands. Basically, you, like one example is like, oh, you have a petition, and you know this person is in charge of like hiring and firing all of us or whatever, and in charge of making the schedule. So it's like, if your demand is about making sure everyone has like fair hours across the board, everyone signs a petition for that, you get outside signatures from like patrons to like this business or whatever, then that individual is your target, and you know, like they're the person you would like ideally present with that petition or something like that. And yeah, you want to make them feel the heat. It's just like, it's always about collective power, worker power, and making sure that like everyone understands what's going on, including like the community members around you, so that way they could like get an understanding of like, oh yeah, like I really love this place, I want to make sure that the people who I engage with every time I go here, and the people who like make this space what it is, like get the fair treatment that they deserve. And your plan to win is, you know, like you're setting up winnable demands, targeting the right people. You don't want to just kind of like not know or not have a specific person in mind whenever you're like presenting an action, because then again, it's just like, it's not targeted. It could be like, it's easier to be ignored when you're not targeting the right people or like a person at all, because then you're not really applying pressure to any individual person or group or whatever. And the more like cohesive all of that is, that plan to win, then the more you're going to propel the campaign forward, and the more, you know, you're going to like build confidence amongst your like community and your union. And examples of collective action, like I mentioned, the petition, email and phone zapping, which like I know is something that Cartoonists United has done with like the payment processors. You have things like zines and flyers and stickers, kind of like fulfilling that activism bit and like making people aware of what's going on and like that a union's trying to form. Marches on the boss, protests, work slowdowns, strikes, and kind of like whatever creative actions you could like think of that kind of like play off these ideas of like everyone working together to basically just like be one loud mouthpiece for the worker, for like the public, and also for like the boss and like whoever the target is. And a big part of any campaign is inoculation, and that is preparing the workers for the possibilities of retaliation, what the boss's response will be, and kind of like just like what to expect, because like you deserve to know the realities of the entirety of like what labor organizing is, that there's always some risk involved regardless of like who's organizing where. But it all comes down to, again, like if we all want the same thing and we can all come together to do it and believe that we could do it together, then it's just like we should still be going forward and like doing it. We shouldn't just like sit idly by and just like be complacent with the situation we're in. And it all is like coming down to, as we're like a big part of like building the solidarity and unity amongst each other, is like working through our fears and worries together and like just being honest about it. And certain responses that you might expect are like, they'll be putting up anti-union propaganda. They might make different threats of like, oh, you might like be fired or like reprimanded or something like that if you so much as talk about organizing. They might lock you out. And again, all these different things, like if you are covered under the NLRA, are illegal to a certain degree. So it's just like, depending on your situation, this is, where you can like file a unfair labor practice with the NLRB. And basically, that helps force the NLRB into ruling like, okay, are you guys being treated as employees or not? So like, do you have the right to unionize? So that's something to keep in mind too, is just like they also face risk and like deciding to like retaliate against you. But this is kind of like where, you prepare everyone for like the possibility of like union busters or like scabs or whatever, and just like how important it is to like maintain the union's vision, like the goals or demands. And this is something that you don't just do during that first conversation. You also do it before like every action, every like petition signature, before you go public with the campaign, after any kind of like retaliation actions, because it's like you want to always like reiterate to people that like we're in this together, because they can't fire everybody because they need their workers, because again, workers are the ones that like are keeping everything going. And yeah, so like bosses, union busters, they're preying on your fear and kind of like the uncertainty. Like they're especially targeting like people who are like uncertain about like, oh, like, do I want to join the union, or like, do I think this is actually going to happen or whatever, and just like really trying to like sow seeds of division. But the more transparency there is, like the more democratic you've built your organization to be in terms of like clearly communicating with each other and kind of like doing the collaborative education for everybody, then the easier it is to kind of like dispel these like misconceptions and like this fear and this idea that like unions are bad, and kind of like help them understand, like what it is the union is doing and why this union exists and like what we can achieve. Because like, look at all these other unions like us who have been able to achieve all these different things because they decided to come together and like still fight. Because like at the end of the day, if you're engaged in organizing, it's going to be life-changing on some level, because it's like you're just going to learn a lot in terms of like I feel like community engagement, and then also just kind of like all these different like leadership skills and just like an understanding of what it means to like act collectively and understand like yourself as not just an individual, but also like as part of like a collective being. And since we just have a few minutes left, or I don't know, I think we might. Well, basically, we're at the end. This is the final slide. This is basically just saying, you know, like, what does a unionization typically look like? So if you're going the traditional route, a bunch of workers come together in a workplace. They sign cards, which is this small legal document that you like present to the NLRB, basically saying like, hey, we want a union. And you ask your employer, like, hey, can you recognize us? Because like every employer can just like voluntarily recognize the union. It like saves them a lot of trouble, but of course, you know, most of the time they might say no. But that again isn't like, oh, now you just give up. It just means, okay, we move forward with the next step. So if they say no to like voluntarily recognizing you, that's when you file your cards with the NLRB. And you move forward with the election. The election date is like set by the NLRB, and a majority of the people who submitted those cards need to vote yes to like win that official union certification. If for whatever reason you like present those cards and the NLRB is like, oh, just kidding, you are like independent contractors, so like we're not going to give you that certification or whatever. Or if they just decide like for whatever reason, even if you're like employees, that like they're not going to certify your union, then one possibility is like, you know, you're striking for recognition. But even if there's no legal pathway, like that one slide that showed like the different grad students and like taxi workers union and stuff like that, like those groups didn't necessarily all have the NLRB certification, but they were still unions, and they were still unions that like won some of their demands and like continue to exist. And once you do the election, say everyone like votes yes, now you get the certification, you're a union, great. Then you move on to bargaining. If you're officially certified, your employer has to bargain with you, and they have to bargain with you over the things that like directly impact you in the workplace. They're called like mandatory subjects of bargaining, and these are things like your wages, your hours, working conditions. And you want to make sure as you're going into bargaining, you know, you've trained your bargaining committee, you have you know, an experienced labor lawyer on your team, or a veteran organizer, or like or consulting with one to make sure, you know, like everyone knows how to go through this whole process. And even though you have your bargaining team like out there bargaining with the employer, that doesn't mean the rest of you just like stop organizing. It's like you're going to continue to organize, you're going to continue to like spread the message about the cause, and also continue to apply pressure. And yeah, like I think kind of like on a good ending point is like a lot of people think joining a union automatically means striking, or that if you join a union, you'll be forced to strike right away. Strikes are a last resort, and you all have to vote to authorize it. So it's just like someone could say like, oh, I think a strike would be a good idea. Everyone goes to vote on it, and it's a majority no, then okay, we don't do a strike. That's not our action. We decide on a different action to kind of like apply pressure or something like that. Like strikes are not something you like jump to right away when you join a union. I think that's just like really important to remember. And that's it. I know there like isn't obviously like space for questions or whatever, but like let me put it in the chat if anyone wants to like know more, or like has any questions about like any of this or whatever. I'm happy to like answer any emails that you guys might have, and like pointing to resources and things like that, and like have a one-on-one conversation with you about it. So that's totally cool. Because that's stuff like I'm also familiar with doing anyways. But yeah, that is the labor organizing presentation.
All
Let
right.
me. Oh, sorry. I'm just like trying to figure out how to turn off the screen sharing.
You're all good. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out for this awesome panel. Nikki, thank you so much for showing off all this amazing info, giving folks a grounding in labor organizing. Again, if folks have questions, you can shoot emails over to that email, artofnickyrodriguez@gmail.com. If you have more questions, specific one-on-one things that might not make sense to cover. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap and get ready for even more Nib and Ink Fest. Thanks so much, everybody.
Au Brésil, raconte-moi. Au Brésil, je ne connais de toi que ces mots-là.
Bossa Nova e tu lo pompa tempo e le bonfa. Bossa Nova,
Va,
ci con qualche un trio camarade.
mais quand on parle de toi, on ne dit que samba, mais il n'y a pas que ça.